German shepherds scratched at the ground nonstop. What emerged shocked even the toughest cops. Sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms, they walk on four legs and carry hope in their eyes. This story will prove that true. But tell me, do you think dogs are born protectors? Or do they choose who to love? Like, share, and subscribe if you believe in the power of loyalty. The evening was cold, the kind that carried a bite sharp enough to make people shut their doors early and draw their curtains tight. Autumn had already stripped most of the trees bare, and in the outskirts of the little town, the silence was so deep that even the rustle of dry leaves felt like a voice in the still air. Street lamps stood far apart, their weak glow barely touching the open fields that stretched like shadows into the distance. It was the kind of night when nothing was expected to happen, just another quiet chapter in a town that prided itself on calm routines. But that calm was broken by a sound that refused to fade. A German shepherd stood in the middle of the field, body tense, ears pinned forward, claws tearing into the earth. His barks rang out one after another, echoing across the silent land. He didn't pause to catch his breath, didn't waver. It wasn't the careless noise of a restless dog. This was different. Every sound carried urgency, every scratch against the soil seemed desperate, as though time itself was slipping away and only he could stop it. At first, people didn't pay him much attention. From their porches and windows, they shook their heads. "Just a stray dog making a fuss," someone muttered. "He's chasing after moles or rabbits," another said with a dismissive wave. Dogs barked at shadows all the time. Everyone knew that. And in a place where quiet was valued, where stillness was a comfort, no one wanted to admit that the shepherd's cries felt heavier than that. Yet there was no denying the way his paws kept ripping into the ground, dirt flying behind him, his nails scraping stone, his body trembling with effort. Something in him was fighting to be heard, but the people weren't ready to listen. Only the little girl in her blue dress, standing a few steps behind, seemed to understand. She clutched her hands together tightly, watching her dog with wide eyes. She didn't cry, didn't try to stop him. Instead, she stood still, her trust in him unshaken. He had never led her wrong before. And if tonight he chose the earth itself as his enemy, then she would wait with him until the secret underneath gave way. The sound of his digging grew louder, harsher, tearing into the silence of the night like a blade. His breath came in sharp bursts, his body low, his tail stiff with warning. With each furious strike of his claws, it became clearer that this was no ordinary patch of ground. The air around seemed to change, heavy and damp, as though the soil was guarding something it did not want revealed. The dog's howls rose higher, his eyes fixed with unshakable fire. The neighbors grew restless. Some shouted from their doors, asking if anyone could quiet him. Others stepped closer, their faces caught between irritation and unease. Something about the shepherd's refusal to stop was unsettling. Why this spot? Why tonight? Even the local policeman, walking by on his evening patrol, slowed his steps, his hand tightening on his flashlight. Minutes stretched like hours. The girl's small figure stood steady, the dog's determination never faltering. And then a pause, only for a breath, before his claws struck deeper, pulling loose a clump of soil darker and wetter than before. A smell rose faintly, not the smell of fresh earth, but something older, heavier, and far less forgiving. The dog let out a deep, mournful howl that pierced through the night. People shifted nervously, their whispers soft but urgent. They had wanted to believe it was nothing. But now, doubt crawled through the crowd like cold fingers. The shepherd wasn't just restless. He was uncovering something. Something hidden. Something meant to stay buried. And as more dirt flew, as his body refused to give up, the truth drew closer with every desperate strike of his claws. What came out of that ground would shock even the toughest cops. The field lay at the far edge of town, where the houses thinned out and the land seemed forgotten. Tall grass swayed in the breeze, brittle and dry after months of neglect. A broken fence leaned against the earth, its wooden posts rotted at the base, some lying flat where storms had pushed them down years ago. Rusted wire curled around the fallen boards like vines, clinging to nothing but memories. Once, long ago, the field might have been used for crops or cattle, but now it was only an empty space where children dared not play and grown-ups rarely walked. Even in daylight, the place carried an uneasy stillness. Birds avoided the tangled grass, and the wind seemed to hush when it passed over. People in town whispered about it when conversations slowed. Some said the land had been cursed after a fire took the life of a farmer's family there decades ago. Others believed it was simply unlucky, a place where tools broke and animals refused to graze. But most simply avoided it, repeating the same words with a shake of the head. That place has always felt strange. On this evening, the shadows fell long across the uneven ground. The baby girl in her simple blue dress toddled along the path, her tiny shoes crunching softly against the dirt. She was no older than 3, her cheeks round with innocence, her steps unsteady but full of curiosity. At her side walked the German shepherd, tall and strong, his thick coat brushing against the tips of the grass. His presence was steady, his body always positioned slightly ahead, as if to shield her from dangers she could not see. The girl held nothing in her hands but the end of a ribbon she had been playing with earlier, letting it trail along the path. Every so often, she would look up at her dog with a trusting smile, the kind that carried no doubt. To her, he was more than a pet. He was her companion, her protector, her world. As they moved deeper into the field, the shepherd suddenly stopped. His body stiffened, his ears shot up, and his tail lowered in warning. The girl froze, too, sensing something had changed. The wind still blew gently, the grass still swayed, but now the air felt heavier, as if the field itself was holding its breath. The dog's nose pressed close to the earth, sniffing with rapid intensity. His muscles rippled with tension, his stance sharp and alert. Then, without hesitation, he began to dig. His paws struck the soil hard, flinging dirt behind him in sharp bursts. Grass roots tore loose, chunks of dry earth scattered in every direction. The sound of his claws scraping the ground cut through the silence like a warning bell. At first, the girl tilted her head, confused. She tugged at her ribbon, watching him with wide eyes. She called softly in her baby voice, but he didn't respond. His entire body seemed consumed by the spot, as if the earth itself had called to him. The field, once so still, was alive now with urgency. The shepherd's breathing came in short bursts, his growls low and steady. Every strike of his paw seemed to say, "Here, right here. Something is waiting." The girl took a small step closer, her little fingers brushing against his back. She didn't try to pull him away. Instead, she crouched beside him, her eyes fixed on the patch of earth he had chosen. She couldn't understand why, but deep in her small heart she trusted him. He wasn't playing. He wasn't restless. He was fighting for something hidden beneath their feet. The fence creaked in the distance, its loose boards rattling in the wind. A crow passed overhead but didn't land, its wings beating quickly as if eager to escape. The world around seemed to shrink, pulling all attention to the single spot where paws tore into dirt. Somewhere, faintly, the girl heard voices. Neighbors walking home glanced across the field, their steps slowing. They saw the shepherd digging, his body tense, his bark fierce, and they shook their heads at first. "He's chasing after moles," one muttered. "Just restless," another said, unwilling to step closer. But still they watched, because there was something in his movements that was not ordinary. Something in the way his fur bristled, the way his eyes blazed, the way he refused to stop no matter how much soil he scattered. The girl stayed close, her blue dress gathering dust, her ribbon forgotten on the ground. Her hand rested lightly on her dog's back, steadying herself as he worked with a determination that grew stronger by the second. The empty field, once dismissed as useless land, was no longer silent. It was alive with sound, the pounding of paws, the sharp breath of a loyal shepherd, the rustle of grass disturbed by his fury. And in that moment, it no longer felt like a forgotten space. It felt like a place about to reveal something no one had dared to imagine, because the shepherd had chosen his ground, and he would not stop until the truth buried within came to light. The German shepherd was no longer simply digging. He was consumed, lost to an instinct that seemed older than the field itself. His body pressed low to the ground, muscles quivering with urgency, every movement sharp and deliberate. His nose shoved into the loosened soil, pulling in the deep, damp scent of earth as though searching for something more than just dirt. Then he would raise his head, growl low in his throat, and strike again with his paws, scattering clumps of grass and mud behind him in a wild rhythm. The sound was unsettling, claws tearing through soil, his breathing ragged, his growls vibrating in the air. It was not the playful scratching of a bored dog, nor the curious digging of one chasing after a mole or rabbit. This was something different. It carried desperation, almost grief, as if whatever lay beneath the ground mattered more than his own strength. The baby girl, standing beside him in her blue dress, could not understand the reason, but she felt it all the same. Her small hands clung to the thick fur along his back, her wide eyes fixed on his every move. At first, she had tugged gently, as if asking him to stop. But when she felt his body trembling, when she heard the strange, mournful whine rise between his growls, her tiny fingers curled tighter, not to pull him away but to hold on. She leaned against him, her cheek brushing his shoulder, as if lending her silent support. The shepherd didn't notice her touch. His world had narrowed to the patch of ground before him, the scent that gripped him, the urgency that drove his claws deeper. Dirt flew against the hem of the little girl's dress, but she didn't step back. She stayed at his side, sensing in her childlike way that this was no game. From the road nearby, neighbors had begun to gather. Their footsteps slowed as they spotted the dog's furious digging, their conversations hushed into whispers. Lantern light flickered as some held them high, their shadows stretching long across the grass. The broken fence leaned behind them, the tall grass swayed, but no one looked anywhere except at the shepherd and the hole he was tearing open. "Why won't he stop?" an older man muttered, his hands tucked nervously into his coat. "It's just a dog," another woman said, shaking her head. "They dig. That's what they do." But her voice was not steady, and she didn't walk away. None of them did. The baby girl looked up at the gathering faces, her lip trembling in confusion. Their murmurs made her uneasy, but she pressed herself closer to her shepherd, burying her small hands into his fur. His growls deepened, vibrating through her fingers, and she felt the tension in his body, tight, rigid, as if he was bracing himself for something terrible just beneath the surface. The whispers among the neighbors grew louder. Maybe he smells something dead. Maybe it's just a buried animal. But no one stepped closer to see. There was something in the dog's urgency that held them back, something almost human in the way he clawed at the ground, as if he was pleading with them to understand. Fear crept through the crowd in slow waves. Some felt it in the pit of their stomachs, others in the cold prickling at the back of their necks. The field had always been strange, a place they avoided. Now, with the shepherd howling and digging, the unease grew stronger. But there was curiosity too, a heavy pull none of them could resist. They leaned forward, their eyes locked on the dog, waiting for something to emerge. The shepherd paused only to sniff the ground, his nose pressed hard into the earth, inhaling deeply, then throwing back his head with a howl that rang out across the empty land. The sound was raw, filled with urgency, a call no one could mistake. It wasn't the warning bark of a guard dog or the happy howl of one at play. It was a cry, loud and mournful, as if he carried the voice of something buried and forgotten. The baby girl flinched at the sound, her little hands gripping him tighter. But she did not cry. Instead, she leaned into him, her forehead pressed against his side, as though sharing his burden. Her innocence, her trust in him, stood in stark contrast to the fearful whispers of the adults watching from the edge. The hole grew larger with every strike of his paws. Earth piled high behind him, grass roots torn and dangling. His coat glistened with sweat, his breath came in short, fierce bursts, but he did not stop. Something inside him screamed that this mattered, that beneath this soil lay the truth he alone could sense. "Dogs know things," a grandmother in the crowd whispered, her voice trembling with memory. "They always know." Her words silenced the others for a moment. They all turned their eyes back to the shepherd, watching his frenzy with a mix of dread and awe. The field that had once been silent was now filled with tension, the kind that made hearts race and hands tremble. Each howl seemed to echo deeper than the last, carrying through the town, pulling more people toward the edge of the grass. Curiosity had become fear, and fear had become expectation. Still, the German shepherd did not stop. His claws tore at the earth, his body hunched low, his every breath a vow that he would uncover what lay beneath. The baby girl stayed beside him, dust on her dress, fear in her eyes, but loyalty in her heart. Together they stood in the fading light, surrounded by whispers and shadows, as the truth beneath the ground waited to be revealed. The sound of the German shepherd's claws tearing into the soil had already drawn curious eyes, but now it began to pull in more than just whispers. One by one, figures appeared along the edges of the field, drawn by the echo of his howls and the strange energy that seemed to rise from that patch of earth. The first to step forward was a farmer, his boots heavy with mud after a long day tending cattle. He was a quiet man, used to the rhythms of soil and season, yet as he leaned against the broken fence and watched the shepherd dig, something in his chest stirred uneasily. He had seen animals behave strangely before, cows refusing to cross a pasture, horses shying away from a barn door, but this was different. This wasn't avoidance. This was insistence, almost demand, as if the dog carried knowledge no human hand had touched. Behind him came the schoolteacher, her shawl wrapped tight against the cold evening air. She carried with her the weight of stories she had heard from children, whispers of the empty field, dares to step into the tall grass, fears of shapes that moved in the dark. She had dismissed them as imagination, the kind of tales children spun to make the ordinary exciting. But as she saw the shepherd's frenzied pause, the urgency in his howls, she wondered if perhaps the children had always sensed something true. The old grandmother followed, her pace slow but her eyes sharp. She had lived through more than most, had seen things in this town that no one liked to speak of anymore. She had lost a cousin in these very outskirts when she was a child, a boy who went missing without a trace. She had never forgotten the silence of that search, the way it had ended without answers. Now, as she pressed her hand to her chest and watched the shepherd claw at the earth, memory weighed heavy. She whispered to herself, her voice trembling, "They always know. Animals always know." Finally, a local policeman approached, flashlight in hand. He was not a man given to superstition, trained instead to look for order and reason. But as he drew closer, the beam of his light cut across the shepherd's form, dirt clinging to his coat, eyes wild with urgency, paws striking faster than before, and even he felt the air tighten around him. The ground seemed alive, responding to every strike of the dog's claws. He tightened his grip on the light, uncertain of what he was walking into. The small group stood together now, watching in silence as the shepherd tore deeper into the soil. None of them spoke at first, unwilling to break the strange spell the moment had cast. The baby girl stood beside her dog, her blue dress smudged with dust, her tiny hand buried in his fur. She looked at the newcomers with wide, uncertain eyes, but did not move. She was as fixed to the spot as her shepherd, bound to whatever truth he was clawing toward. The farmer finally cleared his throat. "That dog's been at it too long," he said softly, though there was no certainty in his tone. "He'll wear himself out." "He won't," the grandmother whispered. "Not until he finds what he's looking for." The policeman stepped closer, crouching near the hole. "Dogs dig," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe it's just a scent, some animal, maybe something dead." He tried to sound firm, but the words did not steady the unease in his chest. The teacher pulled her shawl tighter, shaking her head. "Listen to him. That's not a game. That's not restlessness. That's warning." Her eyes, filled with both fear and fascination, never left the shepherd. The crowd grew thicker, neighbors gathering at the edges of the broken fence, their faces pale in the lantern light. Some crossed their arms, insisting it was nonsense. Others whispered stories they had promised themselves never to repeat. Murmurs passed through the group like a rising tide. "Should we call for help?" someone asked. "No, what could help with this?" another replied. "Should we stop him?" a third voice broke in. But no one stepped forward to try. The shepherd gave no sign of stopping. Food was set near him by a cautious hand, but he ignored it completely. Calls of his name rang out, but he acted as if the world behind him had ceased to exist. His every breath, every ounce of strength, was locked into the dirt before him. His claws tore deeper, the hole widening, his growls low and guttural, each one rolling like thunder through the field. The grandmother closed her eyes, shaking her head slowly. "I've seen this before," she murmured. "When dogs sense what we cannot. When they know what we've tried to bury." Her words silenced the crowd. Even the policeman looked up from the edge of the hole, his jaw tight. The unease that had started as curiosity now settled heavier. Fear had crept into their bones, cold and sharp, but none could look away. The baby girl pressed closer to her shepherd, her face half hidden against his back. She was not afraid of him, not afraid of the earth flying around them. She was afraid of the whispers, of the fear she felt rolling off the crowd. Her dog, she knew, was not wrong. He never was. And so she stayed, her tiny figure standing tall in her innocence, lending her quiet courage to his furious determination. The field that had once been dismissed as empty now held the weight of countless eyes and countless questions. In the glow of lanterns and the beams of flashlights, the shepherd's frenzy became something more than animal instinct. It became prophecy, it became demand, it became the cry of something beneath that refused to stay silent. And as the murmurs rose, as the crowd debated whether to stop him or let him continue, the truth drew closer with each strike of his claws. Something was waiting beneath the soil. Something that would not stay hidden forever. The murmurs of the crowd grew heavier as the shepherd's claws ripped through the soil with an urgency that no one could ignore anymore. His chest heaved, his sides darkened with dust, yet his eyes still burned with the same relentless fire. He was not going to stop. And for the first time that evening, the townsfolk understood. If the truth was to be uncovered, it would not be by the dog alone. The farmer, broad-shouldered and silent until now, stepped forward. He looked at the hole already forming under the shepherd's paws, then at the people around him. "This isn't something he'll let go of," he said, his voice low but steady. "If we don't help, he'll claw himself to blood before he's done." The policeman shifted uncomfortably but gave a nod. "Bring shovels. Lanterns too. We'll see what's down there." It didn't take long for men to return, carrying what tools they could find in haste. Lanterns flickered to life, casting trembling circles of light across the tall grass. Iron shovels gleamed dull in the glow, their handles worn smooth by years of work in the soil. One by one, they stepped into the field, planting their boots firmly near the spot the shepherd had chosen. The dog barked loudly, circling once around the men, pressing close to the hole as if making sure they understood where to strike. His growls rose whenever someone hesitated, as though urging them onward. The first strike came with a sharp clang as iron met hardened earth. The sound carried like thunder through the silence, a reminder that the field was not lifeless. It resisted. Soil broke apart reluctantly under their force, each scoop heavy, each strike met with a low echo. The crowd flinched at the noise, their unease deepening with every clash of shovel against soil. The shepherd barked louder, his voice cutting through the night. Each time a shovel hesitated, he pressed his paws to the dirt, whining sharply, reminding them of the urgency. He paced at the edge, sometimes pressing his nose into the loosened ground, sometimes throwing back his head with a piercing howl that made the air itself tremble. The baby girl crouched close to him, her small hands tangled in his fur, her face pale but determined. She didn't understand what lay beneath, but she felt his urgency as though it were her own. Each bark, each howl, each growl seemed to pass through him into her small frame. She would not leave his side. The ground yielded slowly, but it yielded all the same. With every strike of shovel, clumps of dirt fell away, the hole widening under their effort. The farmer grunted with effort, the teacher's shawl slipped from her shoulders as she leaned forward, and even the old grandmother whispered prayers under her breath, as if her words might steady the trembling earth. Then came a different sound, a hollow thud. The shovel struck something that was not soil. The man holding it froze, his knuckles tight around the handle, his breath caught in his chest. He pressed again, lighter this time, and again the sound rang back, hollow, deep, unnatural. The shepherd lunged forward, barking so ferociously that even the policeman stepped back. His paws scraped the dirt furiously at the new spot, his nose pressed against the earth, his body trembling with a frantic energy. The men cleared more soil, their shovels biting faster now. The hollow sound returned again and again, until at last, the outline of something flat and solid began to emerge beneath the dirt. Lantern light flickered across the surface. It wasn't stone. It wasn't metal. It was wood. Thick, weathered boards buried deep in the earth, their surfaces darkened by damp and time. The crowd gasped, stepping closer, their faces pale in the trembling light. The grandmother clutched her chest, whispering, "Boards, someone sealed this ground." The shepherd whined, his nose pressed hard against the wood, his claws raking the edges as though trying to pry it open himself. His barking grew frantic, echoing across the silent field, pushing the men to move faster. The farmer struck the edge of the boards with his shovel, the sound sharp and jarring. Rusted nails groaned, their hold weakened but not gone. Another man joined him, then another, their tools prying, pulling, forcing the earth to give up its secret. The policeman shone his flashlight over the boards, his jaw clenched tight. He had seen many things in his service, but the sight of a buried structure in the middle of an empty field unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. "Keep going," he ordered, though his voice was hoarse. "We need to see what's under there." The shepherd threw back his head and howled again, a long, mournful sound that carried across the dark horizon. The baby girl pressed closer, clutching at his fur, her small body trembling but her eyes locked on the boards. She didn't understand, but she knew something was waiting beneath. The last of the soil was cleared, the boards fully exposed now. They stretched wider than anyone expected, fastened together in rough shapes, sealed tight with nails long corroded by damp. Time had eaten at them, but not enough. Whatever they covered had been meant to stay hidden. The men stood back for a breath, their shovels heavy in their hands, their lungs burning with effort. The air smelled different now, damp, sour, carrying with it the faintest trace of decay. The grandmother's voice broke the silence, trembling and soft. This field was never empty. It was hiding. The shepherd pressed hard against the boards, barking louder and louder, his nails scraping against the wood as though he would tear it apart with his own body if no one else moved. And then, with one last strike of iron against nail, the first board shifted. A crack split the silence of the night. The sound made the crowd shiver, a sharp, unnatural snap that seemed to echo in their bones. The buried earth had finally given way. The boards were uncovered, and with them, the truth waited just beneath. The night held its breath as the last of the dirt was scraped away. The lantern light shook in nervous hands, casting long shadows that danced across the uneven field. The wooden boards, weathered and blackened by years of damp soil, lay exposed like the ribs of something long dead. The German shepherd pressed his body against them, barking so fiercely that his voice echoed across the empty land. His paws clawed at the edges, his nose shoved into every crack, urging the men to act faster. The farmer tightened his grip on the shovel and pried at the first board. The rusted nails groaned in protest, reluctant to release what they had held down for so long. With a final heave, the board snapped free, the sound sharp as thunder in the stillness. A rush of foul air escaped, rising from the darkness below like a breath held too long. The stench was immediate, sour and damp, carrying with it a weight that made stomachs turn and eyes water. The crowd recoiled, hands pressed over mouths and noses. Someone muttered a prayer under their breath, their voice shaking. The teacher clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders as though it could shield her from the unseen horror rising from the ground. Even the policeman staggered back a step, his flashlight beam trembling as it hovered over the opening. But the shepherd did not retreat. Instead, he threw back his head and howled. The sound was long, mournful, and filled with something more than warning. It was grief, raw and piercing, as though he was carrying the sorrow of whatever had been trapped below. The howl chilled every spine, silenced every whisper. It was not the voice of an ordinary dog. It was the voice of a witness, of a mourner, of something that knew more than they ever could. The farmer, his hands shaking but steady enough to continue, pulled at another board. The others joined him, their tools clanging, their breath shallow, their eyes darting nervously toward the shepherd's howls. One by one, the boards gave way, each snap and crack echoing across the field until the hole yawned open, wide enough to reveal what the earth had kept hidden. Lanterns tilted forward, their light trembling into the space beneath. What lay inside was not what anyone expected. There were no bones, no skeleton as their darkest fears had whispered. Instead, scattered across the damp soil lay remnants of lives interrupted. A torn blanket, its faded fabric clinging to the earth as though it had been wept into for years. A rusted metal box, its lid bent, its sides streaked with corrosion. Scraps of rope, frayed and stiff, still coiled as if once tied for something unspeakable. The grandmother's breath caught. "Oh, Lord," she whispered, her hand clutching at the cross around her neck. Her eyes filled with tears, though she could not yet name why. The teacher pressed a hand to her mouth, shaking her head. This isn't just dirt. Someone was meant to be forgotten here." The policeman crouched closer, shining his flashlight across the remnants. The beam caught the edge of the torn blanket, then glinted against the rusted box. His throat tightened. He had seen evidence rooms filled with artifacts of pain, but never had he stumbled upon them in the middle of a forgotten field, buried like secrets too heavy to carry. The German shepherd pressed forward, paused at the edge of the opening, his eyes blazing. His body trembled, not from fear but from urgency. He barked again, loud and sharp, his voice demanding that they see, that they understand. When no one moved fast enough, he let out another howl, long, aching, filled with the weight of loss. The baby girl clung to his side, her tiny hands buried in his fur. She didn't understand the objects, didn't understand why the grown-ups looked pale and shaken. But she felt her shepherd's mourning, and her own lips trembled as tears welled in her wide eyes. The farmer crouched, reaching carefully toward the rusted box. His hands shook as he lifted it, dirt crumbling away from its surface. The metal groaned under his touch, brittle with age. With a hesitant motion, he pried the lid open. Inside lay scraps of paper, so damp and eaten by time that the ink had bled into blurred stains. One corner of a letter remained intact enough to read, "Forgive me." The teacher gasped, pressing her fingers harder against her lips. The policeman's jaw tightened as he leaned in, the beam of his flashlight tracing the word again and again, as though hoping it would vanish if he looked long enough. The grandmother turned her face away, whispering prayers that trembled on her lips. She had feared this. She had always feared that the field held something more than silence. The shepherd growled low, his eyes locked on the scraps of rope. He pawed toward them, his claws scraping against the dirt as though pointing to the truth no one dared speak aloud. "This isn't just trash," the farmer said hoarsely, his voice breaking the heavy silence. This was buried." The policeman swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the fragments of rope. "Not just buried," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Hidden." The word lingered in the air, chilling the crowd more than the cold autumn night. Hidden. This wasn't chance. This wasn't nature. Someone had chosen this ground to swallow secrets. The shepherd let out one final, mournful howl, his body leaning so far into the opening that the baby girl had to tug at his fur to steady him. His voice carried across the field, across the fences, into the hearts of every witness. It was a sound they would never forget. The field was no longer empty. It was a graveyard of secrets, a place where sorrow had been pressed into the earth with nails and boards, sealed tight, waiting for claws and courage to unearth it. And as the foul air settled, as the remnants lay revealed in the lantern light, no one doubted it anymore. This was not just dirt. This was not just the restlessness of a dog. This was truth, hidden and rotting, finally clawing its way back into the world. For a long moment, no one spoke. The foul air lingered around them, heavy and sour, clinging to their clothes, to their skin, to their thoughts. The lanterns flickered against the night breeze, shadows dancing across pale faces. The objects in the hole, the torn blanket, the rusted box, the scraps of rope, sat like silent accusations, daring anyone to name the story they belonged to. It was the old grandmother who broke the silence first. Her voice was low, cracked with age and trembling with memory. "I remember," she whispered, pressing a trembling hand to her chest. "I remember the summer of '64. A boy disappeared. He was just 7. He was playing near the edge of town, and he never came home." Her eyes filled with tears, not just for the boy but for the way the town had tried to forget. "We searched. For days we searched. The sheriff called it hopeless. Said maybe he'd run away. But his mother never stopped waiting on the porch." The schoolteacher drew in a sharp breath. "I remember that," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "I was only a girl then, but I remember seeing the posters on the post office wall. His name was Samuel. He had freckles and a crooked smile." She looked down at the hole, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. And then one day the posters were gone. Just like that. No answers. Just silence. The farmer shifted uncomfortably, the shovel still in his hand. His brow furrowed as he stared at the rusted box and the scraps of paper within it. "There was another," he said quietly. "A young woman. She was supposed to be married that fall. Folks said she went to visit her sister in the next county, but No one ever saw her again. They stopped talking about it after a while. But I remember her father's face. He never looked the same again. The policeman's jaw tightened. He crouched by the hole, shining his light carefully over the items again. "I've read those old reports," he said, his voice rough, heavy with something he could not disguise. "Cases from decades ago. Missing persons, no evidence, nothing to go on. One by one, they faded into dust. People stopped asking questions because there were never any answers to give." He lowered the light to the blanket, catching its faded threads. But maybe the answers were here all along. A hush fell again, broken only by the steady panting of the German shepherd, still pressed against the hole, his body rigid, his growls low and persistent. He pawed at the dirt again, scattering more soil across the torn blanket. His eyes blazed as if demanding that they not look away, that they not soften the truth into whispers and half-remembered stories. The grandmother stepped closer, her frail hand reaching toward the rusted box. Her fingers brushed against its corroded edge, and she froze. There, half buried in dirt beside it, was a small object she had not noticed before. She bent slowly, lifting it with hands that shook so hard she almost dropped it. When she raised it into the lantern light, a soft cry left her lips. It was a shoe, a child's shoe. Small, leather, worn thin at the edges. Its laces had rotted away, but the shape was unmistakable. The teacher gasped. That belonged to Samuel," she whispered. "I remember. He wore shoes like that. His mother complained they scuffed too easily." She covered her mouth with both hands, tears spilling down her cheeks. The crowd stirred uneasily, their whispers trembling into the cold night air. Recognition passed from face to face. They had all known loss, had all heard stories that were never given endings. And now, here, in the dirt beneath their feet, pieces of those unfinished stories were rising back into the light. The policeman swallowed hard, his flashlight beam unsteady. "This dog," he muttered, shaking his head, "this dog found what we couldn't, what we never even tried hard enough to see." The German shepherd let out a sharp bark, his eyes locked on the shoe now trembling in the grandmother's hands. He pressed forward again, his paws clawing at the ground, dirt flying as though he was determined to unearth even more. His body trembled with intensity, and his growls deepened into something close to a roar. The baby girl clung to him, her wide eyes filled with confusion but also trust. She didn't know who Samuel was, or why the grown-ups looked stricken with grief and fear. But she knew her shepherd was uncovering something that mattered, something the world had tried to bury, but couldn't. The farmer wiped a hand across his brow, sweat mixing with dust despite the cool evening. "All these years," he murmured, "we thought those stories were gone. Thought maybe they were just talk or mistakes. But they were real. They were here all along." The grandmother clutched the tiny shoe against her chest, rocking slightly as though cradling a child. Tears streamed down her face, her voice trembling as she whispered, "The mothers who waited, the fathers who never slept, they were right. They were always right." The crowd grew restless, some stepping back as though the truth was too heavy to stand near, others pressing forward with pale faces, desperate to see more. The policeman stood slowly, his expression hardened with a grief he didn't want to show. "This is evidence," he said firmly, though his voice shook. "Evidence of what was done here. And it's thanks to him." He gestured toward the German shepherd, who barked again, loud and commanding, as though sealing the words with his own vow. The realization spread through the gathered crowd like wildfire. The shepherd had not just been restless, not just chasing shadows. He had uncovered what generations of silence had tried to bury. The empty field was no longer empty. It was a grave of secrets, of unanswered questions, of sorrow too heavy for time to erase. And though the horror of it chilled every heart, there was also something undeniable in the air now. Truth, the last truth. The field was heavy with silence after the discovery of the blanket, the rusted box, the scraps of rope, and the tiny shoe. The air was so thick that it seemed every breath cost effort, every word was caught in the throat before it could escape. People stood in clusters, some weeping softly, some staring blankly at the uncovered boards, others whispering prayers they hadn't spoken in years. The German shepherd, though, was not finished. His body stiffened again, nose pressed low to the ground, ears sharp and twitching. His growls rolled like distant thunder, warning them that the story was not yet complete. Then it happened. The sound, faint, so faint at first that many thought they were imagining it. A tiny whimper, like the soft cry of something too weak to call for help but too alive to stop trying. Heads turned sharply, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" someone gasped. The crowd froze, straining to listen. Again it came, a muffled sound rising from beneath the deeper layers of soil, fragile yet undeniable. The shepherd exploded into motion, his paws striking the earth with a new ferocity, claws tearing at the dirt with wild determination. He barked sharply, turning his head toward the men as if commanding them to hurry. His body trembled with urgency, his tail stiff, his hackles raised. This was no longer mourning. This was rescue. The farmer and the policeman exchanged a glance, their faces pale but resolute. "Get back to digging," the policeman ordered, his voice hoarse but firm. Shovels bit into the soil once more, iron striking with desperate rhythm. Lanterns shook in nervous hands, the light bouncing wildly as men worked faster, driven now not by curiosity but by hope, the desperate hope that life still existed under the weight of earth and time. The shepherd dug alongside them, his paws bloodying against stones and roots, but he did not stop. His nails scraped wood again, deeper boards, hidden below the first set. The men pulled and tore, splinters flying, the hole widening. And then, with one final strike, the last of the soil gave way, revealing a narrow pit cut deep into the ground. A hush fell. Everyone leaned forward, hearts pounding in their ears. Lantern light spilled into the pit, shadows retreating reluctantly to reveal what lay inside. For a breathless moment, it looked empty, only damp earth and tangled debris. And then the movement. A faint shiver. A tiny shape curled against the soil. A puppy. Its fur was matted with dirt, its body trembling violently as though every breath was a battle. Its eyes were half closed, glazed with exhaustion, but it was alive. Against all odds, against the weight of earth and silence, the puppy still breathed. Gasps tore through the crowd, sharp and disbelieving. The teacher dropped her shawl to the ground, her hands flying to her face. The grandmother let out a sob so raw it seemed to echo across the field. Even the farmer's shoulders sagged, his breath breaking into a cry he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The policeman crouched down, his strong hands trembling as he reached into the pit. He scooped the tiny creature up with a gentleness that shocked even him, cradling it against his chest as though it were the most fragile thing he had ever held. The puppy whimpered weakly, pressing its face against the rough fabric of his uniform. The shepherd howled then, a sound unlike any before. It was loud, fierce, but filled with triumph, like the cry of a warrior who had fought for truth and won. He circled the policeman, barking sharply, then pressing his nose against the trembling pup as though reassuring himself it was real, it was safe. The baby girl clapped her small hands, laughter and tears mingling together. She reached out eagerly, and the policeman bent low, letting her touch the tiny bundle of fur. The puppy's eyes flickered open just enough to meet hers, and she giggled through her tears, wrapping her arms around it with the unshakable love only a child could give. The crowd could no longer contain themselves. Tears fell freely, Sobs rose from throats that had stayed silent for years. "It's alive," someone whispered, the words trembling with disbelief. After all this time, something lived. The policeman, usually stoic, blinked rapidly, his jaw tight as though holding back his own tears. He stroked the puppy's fragile head with one rough thumb, his voice breaking as he said, "We thought we'd find only death here. But this is life." The grandmother knelt on the cold earth, her hands clasped, her voice lifting in a prayer of gratitude. "A miracle," she whispered over and over, rocking slightly. "A miracle sent to remind us." Even the farmer, whose life had taught him to accept loss and move forward without asking questions, wiped his eyes with a trembling hand. He looked at the shepherd, then at the child, then back at the puppy, his voice low but clear. "He knew," he said. "That dog knew. He wouldn't stop until we saw it. Until we saved it." The shepherd pressed against the baby girl, licking her cheek as she held the rescued puppy close. The two dogs, one fierce and strong, the other fragile and trembling, were united now in the arms of a child who carried only love. It was a sight so pure, so unexpected, that even the toughest cops in the crowd turned away to hide the tears glistening in their eyes. The pit, once filled with secrets and sorrow, had given up something no one could have believed possible. Not just remnants of tragedy, not just echoes of the past, but a living creature, a symbol of survival, of hope clawing its way out of the dark. And in that moment, the field was no longer cursed, no longer silent. It was alive with sobs and gasps and whispered prayers. It was alive with the truth that even in the darkest places, life could still be found. The German shepherd sat back finally, his chest heaving, his body coated in dust and sweat. His eyes softened as he watched the baby girl cradle the puppy. His mission was complete. He had been the voice no one listened to, the claws that refused to stop, the howl that carried sorrow into action. And now, in the child's arms, life trembled but endured. The townsfolk would never forget this night. The cries that rose from the earth, the moment of disbelief, the tears that followed. Even the hardest hearts, even the toughest cops, had been broken open and remade. Because what had emerged from that pit was not just a puppy. It was proof. Proof that loyalty sees what eyes ignore. Proof that love can dig through darkness. Proof that even in silence, voices wait to be heard. The night that had begun with silence and fear now pulsed with urgency and fragile hope. The puppy, barely breathing, was cradled in careful hands. Its tiny chest rose and fell in shallow tremors, each breath sounding like it might be the last, yet stubbornly refusing to stop. Someone quickly fetched an old quilt from a nearby farmhouse, wrapping the little body in it as though trying to shield it from every cold wind that passed through the field. The policeman, his face lined with disbelief, lifted the bundle against his chest. "We can't waste a second," he said. His voice cracked in a way none of the townsfolk had ever heard before. "Get the vet. Now." A man ran toward the road, waving frantically at a truck parked nearby. Within minutes, the puppy was being carried into town, lanterns and flashlights bobbing along the dirt road like a procession of hope. The baby girl trailed close, her small hand gripping the German shepherd's collar, her steps clumsy but determined. She refused to let them go without her, and the shepherd refused to let anyone move ahead without him. At the small clinic near the edge of town, lights flickered on as the knock at the door came fast and hard. The old veterinarian, hair tousled from sleep, rushed to the door in his worn sweater and slippers. The moment he saw the bundle in the policeman's arms, his face changed. No questions, no hesitation, only action. He ushered them inside, his assistants scrambling to prepare a table, warm blankets, and bottles of milk. The puppy was placed gently on the table. Its whimpers were faint, its limbs weak as twigs, but it was alive. The vet bent low, his stethoscope pressed against its tiny chest. For a moment, he said nothing, only listening. Then he lifted his head, eyes glistening. "He's weak," he murmured. "Very weak. But he's a fighter. We'll do everything we can." The shepherd pressed against the table, his nose nudging the quilt as though reminding the vet that failure was not an option. His eyes never left the fragile body. Whenever someone reached too quickly, he growled low, protective. It was as if he had declared himself guardian of this new life, unwilling to step back even for a moment. The baby girl stood on her tiptoes, her chin barely reaching the edge of the table. She stretched out her small hand, brushing the puppy's paw through the folds of the quilt. The shepherd leaned into her, their bodies pressed together as if they shared the same vow, to keep the tiny creature safe. The townsfolk who had gathered outside the clinic waited in silence, their faces pale but their eyes filled with a fragile kind of hope. For decades, they had carried shadows, missing names, unanswered stories, grief that had hardened into silence. But tonight, from the soil of secrets, a spark of life had risen. When the vet finally stepped back, he spoke louder this time, his voice steady. "He's holding on. He'll need care, warmth, and food, but he's stronger than he looks. He'll make it." The words spread through the crowd like fire. Shoulders sagged in relief, tears flowed freely, prayers whispered into the night turned into grateful sobs. For the first time in years, the town did not feel only haunted. It felt healed. The shepherd lay beside the table, his head resting on his paws, his eyes never closing. He watched every movement, every gesture, as if he understood that this moment was the answer to everything he had fought for. His instincts, his howls, his claws, they had been the bridge between darkness and light. The baby girl, her eyes bright with innocence, began to giggle as the puppy shifted under the blanket. The sound was soft, almost fragile, but it was joy. Pure joy. Her tiny hands clapped together, and she looked up at her shepherd, laughter bubbling from her chest. The dog leaned down, licking her cheek as though sharing in her celebration. Together, they stood as symbols of something larger than themselves. Innocence and loyalty bound together to heal what sorrow had broken. The people around them smiled through their tears. Even the stern policeman wiped his eyes quickly, pretending it was just the sting of the clinic's lantern light. The farmer bowed his head, murmuring, "We came here expecting grief. Instead, he gave us hope." The grandmother pressed her hand to the window, watching the little girl laugh with the two dogs, one strong and steady, the other trembling but alive. Her lips quivered as she whispered, "God sends us reminders in the smallest of ways." Tonight it was this dog. And this child. Inside the clinic, the puppy stirred more strongly, its whimpers growing louder, demanding warmth and milk. The vet fed it carefully, drop by drop, until its tiny body settled into the comfort of survival. Each sound it made, however faint, lifted the weight off every heart in the room. The baby girl, sitting now on the floor beside her shepherd, clapped her hands again as the puppy's cries grew sharper. She leaned against her loyal dog, who lowered his head gently onto her lap. The scene was simple, quiet, yet it melted even the hardest hearts. That night the town changed. They came together not just in sorrow for what had been uncovered, but in gratitude for what had been saved. From the soil of grief had come a fragile life, and with it, the reminder that hope never dies. And at the center of it all stood the German shepherd, his instincts sharper than reason, his loyalty greater than fear. He had dug through silence, fought through doubt, and carried the truth into the light. And now, as he lay beside the baby girl and the rescued pup, his eyes calm at last, everyone knew one thing with certainty: he was not just a dog. He was their guardian, their hero, the keeper of the truths they had buried too long. The following evening, the once-forgotten field no longer looked abandoned. What had been a place of silence, broken fences, and whispers now glowed softly under the flicker of candles. Townsfolk had gathered with flowers in their hands, their faces solemn but softened, as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Where the German shepherd had scratched and barked, a small vigil began to take shape. The ground, once a place of hidden sorrow, now bore symbols of remembrance and hope, bouquets of wildflowers, lanterns, and little wooden crosses carved by local hands. The policeman who had carried the trembling puppy to the vet stood near the front, his cap pressed against his chest. His voice broke the silence, steady but heavy. "Last night, we saw something we cannot ignore. We saw loyalty, not the kind written in laws or taught in schools, but the kind that comes from a creature who gives his whole heart. This dog refused to stop digging until we found what was hidden. He showed us courage we might have walked past. He reminded us that sometimes animals guard the truths that humans bury." Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. The old grandmother, leaning on her cane, whispered to those around her, "This town has carried unanswered grief for too long. But that shepherd, he opened the earth, and with it he opened our hearts." One by one, people stepped forward to place candles near the broken boards that had once concealed the darkness. The teacher spoke of how children often ask questions adults cannot answer, and how sometimes it takes innocence, like the baby girl's trusting presence, to reveal what grown hearts have forgotten. The farmer shared memories of storms and years of loss, his voice rough but honest. "That field always felt strange. I thought it was just land. But now I see, it was waiting for someone brave enough to uncover its story." As the words filled the night air, the German shepherd lay calmly beside the baby girl. She sat in her little blue dress, giggling softly as the rescued puppy tumbled clumsily in the grass. Her tiny hands clapped as she tried to make both dogs chase the ribbons of light flickering from the candles. The shepherd stayed protective, nudging the puppy back whenever it strayed too close to the crowd, while keeping a steady eye on the little girl. The sight of her laughter carried through the gathering like a balm. Hardened men who had fought through seasons of drought and loss wiped their eyes. Women who had carried grief for children long gone pressed hands to their hearts. Even the policeman, who was known for his iron composure, let tears fall freely as he watched the dogs at play. The grandmother's voice rose again, quiet but filled with conviction. "Sometimes God sends us reminders. Last night, it came through a dog's howls, a child's innocence, and a tiny life clawing its way out of the dark. We cannot forget this. We must carry it forward." The teacher added softly, "We tell our children to trust in reason, in rules. But sometimes, the truest lessons come from the unseen. Dogs hear what we cannot. They see what we overlook. They feel what our hearts try to ignore." A hush fell over the crowd as the lantern flames bent with the night wind. The candles flickered like small souls rising from the earth, each flame carrying a memory, a story, a prayer. Someone began to hum a hymn, and slowly voices joined in, not in polished harmony, but in the raw tremble of a community that had rediscovered hope. Through it all, the baby girl's laughter rang pure, her joy untouched by the sorrow of the past. She toppled onto the grass, and the shepherd immediately lowered his body beside her, guarding as she reached for the puppy who curled close against her chest. The image etched itself into every watching heart, innocence embraced by loyalty, life reborn through resilience. The policeman stepped forward once more, his voice quieter now, more intimate. "This vigil isn't just for what was found here. It's for what we nearly lost. The reminder that love, loyalty, and instinct can still guide us. Last night, this German shepherd reminded us that even in silence, the earth remembers. Sometimes it takes a howl, a paw, and the courage of an animal to make us listen." The grandmother nodded, her eyes glistening. And sometimes, she added, it takes the laughter of a child to show us that healing is still possible. As the vigil drew on, the field glowed brighter under the sea of candles. People lingered, unwilling to leave, as though leaving would mean letting go of the fragile unity they had rediscovered. Stories were exchanged, not just about the night before, but about times long past when dogs had guarded farms, saved children from rivers, or simply sat by the bedsides of the sick. Each tale wove into the others until the town's pain felt lighter, shared among many shoulders instead of carried alone. The baby girl eventually curled against her shepherd's side, her eyes drooping with sleep. The rescued puppy nestled between them, its tiny breaths steady and warm. For the crowd, it was more than just a picture of innocence. It was a promise that tomorrow would be different. From broken soil had come new life, and from sorrow had come healing. And as the candles burned low, the townsfolk left the field with softer steps and lighter hearts, carrying with them the truth the dog had unearthed, that love and loyalty often live where humans least expect to find them, waiting only for someone to listen. The night that began with a restless dog's digging ended with a community forever changed. What was once a silent, empty field had become a place of light, healing, and truth. A loyal German shepherd had clawed through the soil not only to uncover what was hidden in the earth, but also to uncover something buried deep in human hearts. The reminder that loyalty, love, and innocence still guide us even when reason falters. As the candles flickered low and the crowd slowly walked home, one thought lingered in every mind. Animals carry instincts humans often ignore. Where people saw only dirt and weeds, the shepherd sensed something crying out from below. Where adults dismissed the howls as nuisance, the baby girl trusted. And in that trust, new life was found. The image of the little girl in her blue dress, her arms wrapped around the rescued puppy, and the shepherd standing guard will remain forever etched in memory. It was more than just a scene of innocence. It was a message, a reminder that sometimes the smallest lives, a child, a puppy, even the determined bark of a dog, can shift the course of an entire community. The policeman later admitted, with tears in his voice, that even the toughest hearts in town were shaken that night. We trained to see evidence, to read signs. But I had to learn this lesson from a dog, to listen when instincts cry out. His words carried the weight of humility, but also hope, because in that admission, others realized they too had a chance to see the world differently. And so, dear listener, I ask you, do you believe dogs can sense what humans cannot? Do you believe that animals, with their pure loyalty and unbroken instincts, sometimes act as the bridge between what is hidden and what must be revealed? If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in kindness. Share it with someone who has almost forgotten that miracles can be hidden in the most unlikely places. Because the truth is simple, healing does not always come through grand gestures or powerful leaders. Sometimes, it comes through the howl of a dog, the laughter of a child, and the tiny heartbeat of a life pulled out of the dark. The German shepherd did not just dig through the soil, he dug through despair. He reminded a weary town that loyalty can uncover truth, that innocence can restore hope, and that love can bind people together when nothing else can. So as you leave this story tonight, carry its lesson with you. Remember that kindness is never wasted, loyalty never goes unnoticed, and hope is never truly lost. It waits quietly, often in places we would never look, until the moment someone dares to listen. If you believe in that hope, if you felt even a spark of it tonight, then let it spread. Leave your thoughts below, tell us where you're watching from, and let this story remind you, and someone else, that the world still holds light even in its darkest corners. And don't forget, like, comment, subscribe, and keep the flame of hope alive. Because sometimes the smallest voices, whether they come from a child, a dog, or a rescued soul, are the ones that change everything.